Welcome, everyone. We are incredibly glad you're joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in.
You are about to embark on a deep dive into something just truly fascinating today. We got our hands on an audio transcript from a Taiwanese pastor.
Pastor Hu Jiko.
Right, Pastor Hu. And this was originally recorded for a Sunday, March 8th message. And reading through it, it really offers this brilliant window into a world that, a lot of people rarely get to see from the inside.
Absolutely.
Whether you are deeply familiar with ancient religious texts or you're just someone who loves analyzing how human beings construct and maintain these complex belief systems, there is an enormous amount to unpack here.
There really is. And the mission of our deep dive today is to examine the sheer mechanics of Christian theology, exactly as it's laid out in this specific transcript. We're going to explore the core concept of Jesus' divinity, which really acts as the absolute engine of this text. But we're also going to look closely at the human side of this equation.
The people actually studying it.
Exactly. How and why theologians dedicate their entire literal lives to studying ancient verses. And perhaps most interestingly for you listening, we're going to examine the profound psychological difference between genuine reverence and a hollow, sort of fear-driven ritual.
Yeah, that psychological aspect is wild. But before we jump in, we should probably set some ground rules for today.
Good idea.
The source material we are working with is, of course, deeply religious. However, our goal here is not to take a side.
Right.
And we are certainly not here to preach at you. Instead, we're stepping into this impartially to explore the ideas, the texts, the belief structures that are contained within this pastor's message.
We're basically treating this as a fascinating case study in theological architecture and human psychology.
Perfectly said. So if you're ready to explore that with us, let's unpack this. And let's start with a scene that introduces a massive theological tension. Let's look at what happens at the Jordan River.
Yeah, so the transcript immediately centers on a highly specific historical and theological moment. This is drawn from the book of Matthew. Pastor Hu references a daily devotional written by Pastor John MacArthur, who apparently did an extensive 8-part breakdown of just a few verses, specifically Matthew chapter 3, verses 1 through 17.
I just have to stop you right there because the math alone is wild to me. An 8-part breakdown on just 17 verses.
Yeah.
That immediately sets the tone for the microscopic level of detail we're dealing with today. Now, this specific passage in Matthew, it describes a scene at the muddy banks of the Jordan River. And it presents this huge paradox.
It really does.
Because in this theological framework, Jesus is viewed as completely, perfectly sinless, yet he goes down to the river to be baptized by John the Baptist.
Right.
And for a lay audience, baptism in this specific context was a ritual meant exclusively for sinners who were seeking repentance. So the obvious question is, why would a completely sinless figure submit to a ritual designed for sinners?
Well, according to the source, that contradiction is entirely deliberate. It forces the reader to really lean in. The text explains that Jesus submits to this ritual to, quote, fulfill all righteousness.
Fulfill all righteousness. Which, that sounds like heavy theological jargon. What does that actually mean in plain English?
Right, think of it kind of like a master architect who refuses to skip any steps in the building code, even if they already know the building's going to stand perfectly fine.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, so Jesus didn't need the cleansing of baptism, but by participating in it, he was perfectly aligning himself with the required blueprint of obedience that God had set out for humanity.
He's checking every single box required of a faithful human being.
Exactly.
Yes.
But the pivot upon which this entire narrative turns isn't actually the baptism itself.
Right.
It's what happens the exact second he comes out of the water. The text describes a voice from heaven declaring, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased."
The narrative structure of that moment is just brilliant.
It's striking.
You have this profound act of physical and spiritual humility, literally wading into muddy water to submit to a human ritual for sinners. And it's instantly followed by this booming cosmic elevation.
And when you zoom out and look at the theology as a whole, this verbal confirmation from God serves as the ultimate proof of Jesus' divinity.
It's not just a pat on the back.
No, not at all. It's not just a nod of approval from a mentor. It is a cosmic validation that only the true Son of God could ever receive. And according to Pastor Hu's message, this moment establishes the absolute core of the gospel.
It forms the theological bedrock.
Exactly. Without that definitive statement of divinity, the rest of the framework simply collapses.
It's the anchor point. But what's fascinating is that once Pastor Hugh establishes that baseline divinity at the Jordan River using the book of Matthew, he immediately shifts gears.
He takes a big leap.
He really does. He takes the listener from an earthly river to a cosmic scale, moving over to the book of Hebrews, specifically chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. So if Matthew establishes the baseline, how does Hebrews build on this architecture?
Hebrews provides this vivid, sweeping definition of who the Son is. And it draws a hard, non-negotiable line in the cosmic hierarchy. The descriptions here are just monumental. The text states that Jesus is the heir of all things. He is the creator of the universe. He is described as the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of God's being.
Wow.
Furthermore, it says, he is the one who sustains all things by his powerful command, and he sits at the right hand of the majesty in heaven.
The radiance of God's glory. That language is just explicitly designed to inspire awe.
Absolutely.
But if Hebrews is elevating the Son to this ultimate creator status, where does that leave the rest of the spiritual beings mentioned in these texts? Like, what about angels?
The contrast the text makes there is sharp, really sharp. According to Hebrews, angels are nowhere near the same level in this cosmic hierarchy.
Not even close.
Now, they're described merely as winds and flames of fire. They're ministering spirits, essentially they're servants. The text makes a pointed argument by stating that God never ever said to an angel, "You are my son, today I have become your father."
That raises such a fascinating question about the mechanics of this belief system. Because you have to wonder, why spend so much time clarifying the exact difference between the Son and the angels? Why does that hierarchy actually matter to the person sitting in the pew on a Sunday morning?
The implication for believers is massive. Pastor Hugh connects this thought to Colossians chapter 1 and John chapter 14 to establish a fundamental theological rule.
What's the rule?
Because Jesus and God are entirely one, a believer cannot truly worship the true God without also worshiping Christ. The identities are completely intertwined.
Which means any attempt to separate them breaks the theological rule entirely.
Precisely. The transcript even points out a crucial nuance regarding the word Father. It draws this sharp distinction between God acting as the Father of Jesus, which is a unique, exact, and eternal relationship,
Right.
versus God as the Father of believers, which is a very different dynamic seen in passages like Matthew chapter 6. So the hierarchy is not just some list of ranks to memorize. It defines the exact nature of how a human being is supposed to interact with the divine.
But if the stakes of understanding this cosmic hierarchy are as high as Hebrews claims, literally the difference between knowing the Creator versus just a servant, how on earth is a modern believer supposed to grasp that?
It's tough.
Right, because we live in a world of 15-second attention spans.
Mm-hmm.
Grasping the, quote, radiance of God's glory seems like it requires a completely different cognitive skill set than what we use today.
It requires an intense level of study,
Mm-hmm.
and that is exactly where Pastor Hugh takes the conversation next. He points his listeners to a Chinese theologian named Pastor Stephen Tong.
Okay.
He specifically recommends Pastor Tong's lectures on Reformed theology.
Let's pause real quick and just define that term for anyone who might be unfamiliar. What exactly is Reformed theology in this context?
Sure. For a lay audience, Reformed theology is basically a framework that emphasizes God's absolute sovereignty over everything. If you imagine human history as this massive, complex novel, Reformed theology views God as the ultimate author of the book. He holds total control over the narrative, rather than just being a powerful character reacting to events inside the story.
That makes sense. And that actually brings us to one of the most staggering details in this entire source text.
Oh yeah, this part is amazing.
Because Pastor Hugh uses Pastor Tong as an example of what it looks like to seriously study this material. He mentions that Stephen Tong spent nearly 10 hours, broken up into 5 or 6 separate sessions, teaching on just the first 2 verses of Hebrews chapter 1.
2 sentences.
2 sentences. The verses that simply explain how God spoke through prophets in the past and now speaks through the Messiah. 10 hours on that.
It's unbelievable.
I don't think I've spent 10 hours analyzing the terms and conditions of my own mortgage, let alone 2 sentences from an ancient letter. I want you listening right now to just imagine the sheer level of intellectual rigor required to stand in front of a room and extract 10 hours of meaning from 2 sentences without just repeating yourself.
Right. What happens to a person's brain when they focus intensely on one text for that long? It is the exact opposite of our modern shallow scroll. It requires mapping an entire universe of meaning within just a few words. And the transcript notes that Stephen Tong is over 80 years old, and he's been preaching for nearly 70 years.
Wow. Let that sink in. 70 years.
70 years dedicated to dissecting and explaining these texts.
It is a lifetime entirely consumed by the pursuit of meaning. It's like looking at a single drop of water under a microscope and somehow finding an entire ocean inside of it.
And Pastor Hugh emphasizes that this lifelong dedication has left a massive legacy of audio recordings. These recordings provide highly systematic, positive, and deeply constructive help to the entire Chinese-speaking world.
That's a huge impact.
It really is. When you think about the impact of that 10-hour marathon, it highlights the profound, almost bottomless depth that theologians see in these texts.
It's really beautiful, whether you share the faith or not, to see that level of human dedication. But, theology is just theory until it heads the real world. Right. A 10-hour lecture is impressive, but how does it actually change how a person acts on a Tuesday afternoon? That is where Pastor Hugh takes his congregation next. He brings all of this high-level cosmic hierarchy right back down to earth to the present day in Taiwan.
He does. The transcript grounds itself in the very immediate practical reality of a local church. Pastor Hugh mentions that it's Sunday, and he is preparing to teach an adult Sunday school class alongside newly appointed deacons at Beipu Church.
And he introduces a very specific theme for this teaching session at Beipu Church. The theme is, fear God so you fear nothing.
Such a powerful phrase.
It is. And this is where we hit the deepest psychological insight of the entire transcript. Pastor Hugh starts unpacking the dangerous difference between true reverence and empty ritual.
This is a critical distinction in the psychology of human behavior. Pastor Hugh issues a stern, very clear warning to his congregation against building a faith that is based merely on the fear of being punished.
Right.
Because if your faith is entirely fear-based, if you are only showing up because you are terrified of divine retribution, then your faith devolves into a mere, quote, sense of ritual.
Let's apply that psychology to everyday life just for a second, because fear-based compliance is everywhere. Think about a toxic workplace.
Oh, absolutely.
If you only follow the rules because you are terrified your boss is going to fire you, you don't actually respect your boss. And you certainly don't care about the company's mission.
No, you're just in survival mode.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're going through the motions. You have a sense of ritual. And the same goes for parenting. If a child only obeys because they are terrified of being grounded, that isn't respect. It's just threat management.
That is a perfect parallel. Because what Pastor Hugh is arguing is that if a believer treats God like a toxic boss, it becomes hypocrisy. You might have the perfect attendance record at church, you might know all the traditions, and you might stand up and sit down at all the right times.
But you miss the point entirely.
You miss the entire point.
Pastor Hugh explicitly notes that if you are just cowering in fear, you miss out on understanding true grace. You miss the depth of God's divinity that we discussed in Hebrews, and you miss the reality of Christ's redemption.
Yes.
Let's unpack those terms too, because they carry a lot of weight. In this psychological framework, what does missing out on grace and redemption actually mean for the individual?
Well, grace in this theological context means unmerited favor. It means receiving love and forgiveness that you did not earn and could never pay back.
Okay.
And redemption is the concept of being bought back, rescued, and restored to your original value. So if your entire worldview is focused on dodging lightning bolts and avoiding punishment, you are incapable of experiencing grace or redemption.
Because you're just too busy surviving.
Exactly. A fear-based compliance is incredibly fragile because it relies entirely on an external motivator. What Pastor Hugh is pushing for is an internal transformation.
He's asking them to move from paralyzing terror to a profound, awe-inspiring reverence.
And when you have that kind of reverence, when you truly fear God in the sense of ultimate respect and awe for the creator of the universe, then the everyday anxieties, the fears of the human world, the fear of failure, the fear of what other people think, they begin to lose their power over you.
Hence the phrase, fear God so you fear nothing.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for the people sitting in those queues at Beipu Church? Pastor Hugh makes it very clear that his ultimate goal for his congregation is not just to have them sit passively in a room and listen to an 80-year-old scholar. The goal is action.
The goal is application.
Yes, to take these massive theological concepts and let them actively transform your character.
The text explicitly calls for believers to take this transformed character and put it to work. They're called to care deeply for their families, to step out into their communities, to serve others, and to spread the gospel message.
The theology is the root, but the character and the service are the fruit.
That's a great way to put it, because if the theology does not produce tangible, positive changes in how a person treats their family and their neighbors, then it remains stuck in the realm of empty ritual.
It's the difference between memorizing a recipe and actually baking the bread to feed your family. You have to do the work, or the knowledge is basically useless.
As we sort of synthesize this journey we've been on today through Pastor Hugh's message, we've really covered an incredible amount of ground.
We really have.
We started at the muddy banks of the Jordan River, exploring the theological paradox of a sinless Jesus submitting to baptism to complete the blueprint of obedience, only to receive cosmic validation as the divine Son.
Which was the bedrock proof of divinity that anchors their entire worldview.
Right. And from there, we looked at the stark cosmic distinction drawn in the book of Hebrews, that impassable gulf between the Creator who sustains the universe and the angels who merely serve as winds and flames.
The hierarchy.
Yes, the hierarchy. And then we explored the staggering intellectual stamina of Stephen Tong, spending 10 hours unpacking just 2 sentences of that cosmic reality.
It still blows my mind.
And finally, we landed in a Sunday school classroom in Taiwan, grappling with the intensely human struggle between cultivating genuine, life-altering reverence versus falling back into hollow, fear-driven religious routines.
It is a massive journey, going from the cosmic all the way to the deeply personal. And I want to connect that lesson from Beipu Church directly back to you listening right now. Because that psychological trap, the danger of just going through the motions out of a fear of punishment or a fear of failure, that isn't just a religious issue.
No, not at all.
That is a universally human issue. In whatever you do today, whether it's your job, your academic studies, your hobbies, or even how you show up in your relationships, ask yourself a hard question. Are you just going through a sense of ritual because you are afraid of failing, afraid of being judged, or afraid of getting fired?
Right, are you just dodging the lightning bolt?
Exactly. Or are you genuinely deeply engaging with the core purpose of what you are doing? Are you operating out of anxiety or out of a true reverence for the life you're living?
Because when the fear of failure is removed, what is the actual foundation of your actions? Are they rooted in something meaningful, or is it just survival?
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. Think back to Pastor Stephen Tong and his meticulous 10-hour study of Hebrews. Think about the sheer weight and value he placed on those words.
10 hours on 2 sentences.
Now, I want you to imagine your own life. If a scholar were to sit down and spend 10 hours deeply, rigorously analyzing just 2 sentences that perfectly define your life's core philosophy, what would those 2 sentences be?
That is a question that demands some real reflection.
It really does. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We loved exploring this with you, and we will see you next time.